All right. Okay, I will go ahead and kick us off. Good morning. My name is Andrea Sobrato, and I'm the Associate Director at the Child and Family Policy Institute of California, standing in today for our Director, Stuart Oppenheim, who typically welcomes us, but he is at the coast facilitating another event this morning. So it's my honor to welcome you to our second webinar in the series of 3 webinars designed to provide a rich and expanded understanding of the thrivance within and across our Latinx families who interface with child welfare, and to create a forum for sharing practice and leadership ideas that cultivate increased effectiveness. But I'd like to pause right here and acknowledge the great sadness that fell upon our country yesterday as we lost 19 children and 3 adults in Uvalde, Texas. In the midst of such sadness and tragedy in our country and heartbreak that has happened because of violence. And as we enter this particular space today, I'm reminded of something former foster youth poet and author Dr. Jaya John said about the intersection of humility and justice. He said, "True humility lets its spirit be broken, not in a paralyzing guilt, but in a conviction of justice and repair. True humility does not put the subject on fiscal calendar. It plants the priority firmly in the heart of the mission. Cultural humility, when authentic, is a system people's way of saying we have done great harm and we will never go that way again. Ultimately, it is a faith in the devalued peoples, that they are true and full human beings with every sacred right and power to heal themselves. That the system is not to be a great authority, but the willing student and helper, and that the people must now and forever be regarded sacredly." Over a year ago, CFPIC began our Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion webinar series, much like Jaya John described, as students, with the expressed intent to lean in and learn about different cultures and communities of people and their experiences with child welfare, so that we could integrate wisdom from lived experience, examples of culturally responsive and innovative practice, and critical tenets of leadership into our evolving child welfare practice model, the CPM. We began our webinar series with a focus upon the history and experience of African-American families in child welfare. And we examined some ideas and strategies that might counteract deep structural, historical, and institutional racism, followed by a deep dive into the history and experiences of the tribes, sovereign nations of people who have also interfaced with the child welfare system, and the imperative calling upon each of us to carry out ICWA in a way that honors the tribes as sovereign nations and as an absolute standard from which all interaction must flow. In each of the prior 7 webinars, we have also linked CPM practice and leadership behaviors to those positive examples of effective and innovative practice and organizational shifts. We all know, particularly here today, that there is often a correlation between a whole host of social and economic contexts, such as race, class, citizenship status, sexual orientation, gender identification, ability, other factors. But there's a correlation between those factors and a disproportionately higher rate of representation in public social service systems and often poorer outcomes. But the good news is that CPM was designed to intervene in a very tangible way, offering us behavioral and descriptive guidance to counteract those inequities. And here's the hope, that when CPM practice and leadership behaviors are operating consistently, we are working together to counteract power differential, bias, and marginalization that can happen between big systems and individual people, particularly exacerbated by the trauma and isolation that can occur around system intervention if that intervention lacks authentic engagement, cultural responsiveness, and sharing and planning and decision-making. The premise is that the use of CPM as a vehicle for change can help us advance racial and social justice, even within the context of child welfare. And for all of us, this is good news. So with that said, even on the cusp of what's just happened yesterday and recently even in New York, with that said, let me welcome you to a final time to the Latinx webinar, which will highlight stories of effective engagement practices and the champions who lead them. There are glimmers of hope all over today's webinar, and you are here because you radiate that hope. What a treat to hear today from our very own colleagues who certainly demonstrate amazing grace. Let's do some housekeeping as we get going. If you've been in the last couple of years, you know that we should probably mute, but please do interact with content and chat with the folks who have the space, who are on mic. Feel free to drop your comments. We will do our best to respond to the material in chat in real time. And then you also will get a copy of this PowerPoint and the recorded version and any materials that the presenters use. That will be emailed to everybody here immediately after the webinar, just as soon as we can. And then finally, I'd like you, if you identify in any way with any of the rich and diverse Latinx communities, give yourself a shout out and hover over your name in your individual video screen. You can hover over your name and 3 dots will appear and you'll have a choice to rename. Put a comma and let us know if you're Cuban or Puerto Rican or Mexican or Guatemalan or El Salvadorian, however you identify. We're here to learn from you. Let us know who you are. And I hope that everybody today finds this space welcoming and honoring and healing. With that said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Virginia Hernandez.
Good morning. It's good to see so many people here today. I want to thank you for attending and joining us on that path of learning that Andrea just spoke about. Your input today is going to be very helpful to us and among us. The first slide we're showing you who is why Latinx. Latinx is a term that's used to describe individuals from various Latino cultural backgrounds. We purposely use the word Latinx because it is inclusive beyond just what you look like, but also forms of intersectionality that some of us in Latin culture possess. So Latinx is the word that we're using for this series. Here are the learning objectives for today's session, as well as all 3 of the webinar sessions that we've constructed. The first session, which is now available online through the CFPIC website, focused on understanding history, oppression, and differences within Latinx populations, and also acknowledges some of us who might also claim the Latinx culture and characteristics because through biracial means. Yes, just want to acknowledge that. We also are using data to anchor meaningful stories of Latinx groups in the US and their experiences in the child welfare system. So data was presented in the first session, we'll present some more today. The third objective is to value meaningful behavioral changes at all levels to sustain what we consider to be healthy organizational culture and climate that lifts up the voice of the Latinx community. And the fourth objective is to reinforce the role of leadership, to use CPM, as Andrea discussed, as the vehicle to improve
Awesome.
experiences and
I'll talk with you.
for Latinx children and families that are engaged in the child welfare system. Thank you. Today we have a series of lead presenters, myself, Virginia Rondero Hernandez. We also have Javi Perez from Northern Academy, Barrett Johnson from formerly San Francisco County and also Caswick, Anita Barbie, who many of us know, Judy Weber from Ventura County, and Gary Taylor from Orange County formerly, and our current coach. Okay, thank you. And here's the agenda for today. You've heard the welcome. Again, as was described, this is the second of a three-part webinar series. Today, we're emphasizing the importance of organizational culture and climate as we strengthen a more race equity, inclusive focus within the culture of the organization. How do we do that? Using data to inform any kind of RE efforts that can happen at the organizational level. There'll be a breakout session, a break for all of us, and also a panel discussion at the end of representatives from Ventura and Monterey County. You want to be here for that for sure. Then I'll close it along with a little hint of what's going to happen in the third session on June 29th. I'm going to hand this over now to my colleague Javi Perez from Northern Academy.
Javi, you might be muted. I don't know if I see him here. I don't know if maybe he's having an audio issue.
Virginia or Anita, would you want to pitch it?
I apologize.
There he is.
Here we go. Hi, Javi.
I apologize. I even restarted my computer this morning and something happened. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Expect the unexpected. So as I continue on, what I was going to say was some people think of organizational culture and climate as the same, but there's some nuanced differences as to what it really is. So I just want to tease that out for a bit. When we think about culture specifically in organizations, it's really characterized by that direct behavior in a work environment, those shared behavioral expectations. It's more ingrained. It's like those unwritten rules. And perhaps the personality of the organization, the personality really emerges. Some examples I think about some organizations are those traditional set strict values and strict norms, where it sometimes feels very hierarchical. It's from the top down and it's very rigid, whereas others are more open and more inclusive and more innovative. So you'll see those different personalities emerge. If you're in a large or medium-sized county, you may see that the personality of the organizational culture may vary by the office that you set foot in. In my 21 years in child welfare, 20 of them were at San Diego County, rather large, second largest in the state as far as a county. 6 different offices and also specialty programs. When I would step foot into a different office, it had a different culture. It had a different set of norms and personalities that came together and kind of felt different. And some were more welcoming, some were more rigid, some were more innovative, and it really varied. If you're in a smaller county, you might see that it feels the same because you're all coming together in that same office and you only feel one way with that personality. Next slide, please. When we think about key predictors of outcomes with organizational culture, there's some really key pieces with the research. There's proficiency, there's resistance, and there's rigidity. So that proficiency is what we know about the competency. We want staff of all levels that are very competent in the work and understand how to do their job, right? Their roles and their responsibilities. That resistance, we have to know that that's normal. Resistance is normal in the work. Just like if you're a line worker and you're working with families, You're going to have that resistant family. We're going to have staff that are resistant. But workers are expected to reject those new ideas sometimes and innovations through either apathy, passive noncompliance, or active suppression of change. We as human beings, we tend to resist change. In this global pandemic, in all that we've experienced in the last 2 to 3 years, there's resistance that we have because we don't want these unfortunate changes. It's scary. It's scary to have these things happen to us. When we think about that rigidity, it's common with organizations to have rigidity, those behavioral norms and expectations for highly centralized decision-making. There's lots happening. It can feel in the bureaucracies that we work in that it's very stifling. And so we have to kind of rise above and find the innovation, but it's not easy. Again, that resistance comes into play as well. So all of these are intertwined. Next slide, please. So developing a learning organization. We often say in the training and workforce development world, we want folks to have a learning organization. We want folks to support growth and change. But again, with human behavior and the way our systems are built, it's not easy to make that change. And it's easy to get into the liability pieces. When on the county level, when you have that child fatality, or you have that high risk case where things are happening, that can co-create a very fear-based culture, and it can feel scary for folks. And so naturally we can retreat as humans and not focus on the growth and the learning that needs to occur. But I argue that we must find ways to have more open systems. We must find ways to be more inclusive, to find our rhythm and our voice with not only including others within our system, which is really CPM, but also externally. When we think about our community partners, our service providers, our core partners, how do we start to dismantle those hierarchical structures that are very rigid and become not only more inclusive, but more innovative, and listening to those new ideas that may spark change. In that unfortunate event that happened yesterday, and thank you, Andrea, for highlighting that, things are only going to change even in our global structure in the US if there's policy changes, if people rise up and advocate as social workers to make change. It's the same within our system, within child welfare. We have to rise up and advocate and really promote that learning culture so that we can grow together and that we start to move away from the fear-based culture. So defining organizational climate, I mentioned that culture was really more about the personality of the organization. You can think of climate as the mood. What mood do you feel when you're in that office, right? Because usually it's pretty palpable. And you're going to hear me say this over and over, that even though leaders definitely model what the mood is, we're all ultimately responsible for what that mood looks like, because we all have a sphere of influence. And yes, leaders from directors to executives to managers and supervisors, they are definitely creating a mood, but so are we when we're line workers, when we're support staff. Regardless of your role, we do have a mood that we bring into the room. And I know not only today, but often we're in the Zoom rooms. We can still feel energy, maybe not at the same level, but we feel a certain way when somebody is engaging with us. Those of you that know me well, my personality is pretty engaging. I like to connect with others. That's why I invited you to turn on your video if possible, because I love seeing people. And sometimes I miss that in-person connection, right? And so really my personality is naturally an engaging person. And the mood I usually bring into the room is that sense of connection and to bring people together. And I give that personal example because we all, as professionals and as humans, we do have a way about us, and we do have a personality that we bring to the work. But I'm going to invite you to do, as I'm sharing some of these stories, I'm going to invite you to put into chat, what are your stories? How do you personally connect with others? And what do you bring? What is that personality that you bring to the work? And then what is that mood attached to that personality? Because again, we all co-create what this learning organization looks like. I'm not going to always monitor the chat in full transparency because we have a lot to talk about today, not just my section, but other presenters. But I do invite you to connect with each other in chat so that we can learn from each other. Thank you, Andrea. So key organizational climate predictors of outcomes. There's 3 that the research shows that are really impactful when we think about organizational climate. There's the engagement, there's the functionality, and then the stress. We know all too well with the stressors that have happened throughout the last several years. Yesterday, I was at a wonderful burnout summit. UC Davis, who I work with, my colleagues, my director, Allison Book, and my colleague, Emma Black, took the lead in that summit. It was a wonderful time to really not only connect with others, but pay attention to where we're at in the work and be very transparent and honest with each other about what we're all struggling with. This is unprecedented times. And sometimes I even say it's a crazy world because it feels that way sometimes. And how do we not only pay attention to what we need as individuals and professionals, but how do we support each other in the work? And when we think about our Latinx staff members, we all come from different backgrounds. I'm looking at the screen now and I'm seeing not only myself as Mexican American, I'm seeing so many different people from so many different rich cultures and backgrounds. And we have to not only honor that, but how do we pay attention to everyone? When we think about that stress piece, everyone is responding to this pandemic differently. And it's okay. It's okay that we're having different stressors. It's okay that we're responding to this differently. It's more about how do we pay attention to what we need and how do we help our colleagues and each other to move forward. The stress also creeps in even before the pandemic when I think about our Latinx coworkers that are bilingual. And oftentimes they have higher caseloads and they're doing policies that are in Spanish and sometimes other dialects that take a lot of time and attention. And sometimes they feel overwhelmed and overburdened. So that's one example, right? So again, if you want to put any of your examples into the chat, I encourage that interaction in the chat so you can hear from your colleagues, you can learn from each other, from other counties and other places as to what's going on for you. That engagement, when we think about workers feeling able to accomplish many personally meaningful things in the work and remain personally involved in their work, there's lots of research around why people stay in different organizations and why they leave. In child welfare specifically, I would love to see more counties do more stay interviews. We'll talk about that a little later. We hear about the exit interviews, why people leave, but why those of us that have been here 10, 15, 20 years plus, why do we stay? Part of it's connection to the work and the meaning in the work. The other thing that the research does say is around that confidence piece. When we feel confident and connected to the work, we tend to stay. But I'm curious as to, and feel free again to put this in the chat, what do other folks think about stay interviews? Has your county or your organization tried that to see why people are staying in this work, even when it's more challenging than ever in today's world? Next slide, please. This slide is actually from the University of Kansas. They partnered with their School of Social Welfare. Kansas is actually one of the pilot states for FFPSA. So when we think about the prevention work in Families First, and we know it's in its infancy with child welfare agencies moving towards that prevention model, Kansas is kind of leading the early research and the early outcomes as what is best practice. So early on, what they're finding from an organizational level is something that we've always known, but it's validating. And that's why I put this slide up. We really want a multi-sector system when we think about child welfare. When we also think about CPM, it's around that consensus, all levels of staff being included, that it's not just leadership driven, that we're all working on this together with the same goals, the same mission, the same values, that we're intentional, that we're holistic and cross-cutting, that we're including the community, that when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, that we're having multiple voices at the table, not just one type of voice. When we think about how people in other organizations operate outside of child welfare, they are becoming more inclusive. And I'm seeing that in some counties in child welfare, but we need more of that, because when we think about that collaboration, when we think about that program scope being more holistic, we can't do it alone. We know that if we do more of the same, if we're just trying to be that hierarchical system that's just coming in and removing kids or intervening in families' life, we're just going to get the same outcomes. So we have to be more innovative. We have to involve others. And that involves not only the community, but that involves our tribes, that involves our service providers, everyone that's willing to partner with us. We need to allow that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about adaptive leadership principles. Some of you have heard of this before, but I'm going to tease this out a bit. This may be new for some of you, but in the research, there's some really key components of adaptive leadership principles. The first one is emotional intelligence. When I was at the Burnout Summit yesterday, one of our first presenters was talking about, in the global research of all organizations across the US, emotional intelligence and empathy for staff is a key predictor of staff engagement. So when we think about that, how do we lean into the human side of the work? We know that child welfare is a very serious type of work. It's a very important type of work. And we also have to lean in as leaders to the humanity of our work. And a workforce that feels heard and supported is much more likely to put in the hard work it takes to help achieve organizational goals. Sometimes when we're stressed, and we even talked about this yesterday in the Burnout Summit, when we're stressed and busy, leaders tend to lose their empathy and are higher in apathy. But we have to focus as leaders with the opposite. We have to have that heart center. We have to find that humility and that sense of connection with their staff, or else they are going to become disengaged. That's a reality in the work. Organizational justice, that's another huge principle. When we think about leaders being adaptive and tending to DEI efforts, it's really about engaging stakeholders, listening to what staff want and need, paying attention to your data. In a little bit, Barry's going to talk about the data in child welfare, and really being transparent about what's not working, and also leaning into what you don't know and being honest about, I don't know how to do X with this organizational justice, but I'm willing to learn. Again, going back to that learning organization and that growth mentality, if we have that as leaders and we're modeling that we want to grow, our staff are more likely to lean into that growth process. Next slide, please. Development. This is one of my favorite aspects of adaptive leadership, because it's really empowering employees to reach their full potential. Whether it's coaching, mentoring, helping with a new initiative and supporting your staff in their role to grow with CPM, perhaps it's ICPM or SOP, whatever that initiative is, that you're supporting your staff in their development. Because if you're a director or a deputy director or even a manager, you know you can't do the work all by yourself. You need help. And you need your staff, and you want staff to be not only engaged in this work, but competent and feel like that they know that you have their back. So as leaders, we have to focus on that development piece. Sometimes when I've had staff that want to go into a promotional arena and I see that potential, there is that initial piece of me that thinks, oh, I'm going to lose a really great staff. They're amazing. And internally I'm thinking, I don't want to lose them. But ultimately, I want to support their development as a leader, because it's important that I support their growth. And then the character. The character of the leader is so important. Again, transparency is key. Finding ways to not only embrace diversity,
I know why I wasn't getting
paying
this.
attention to how diversity
Why?
fit the
Because I
organization.
didn't keep it dropped.
So it's real important that we, again, have that transparency, and that as a leader, you're modeling by doing. So you're not just saying, but you walk your walk, right? You don't just talk your talk. You follow through with what you say you're going to do. With that said, we make mistakes. And as leaders, we know I've made mistakes. Sometimes it's daily, but owning those mistakes and learning from those mistakes is what's going to help not just me grow, but all of us grow together. When we think about our Latinx employees, paying attention to what their needs are, paying attention to how they view the work. They may view the work differently than people from other cultures. I know that for me, the way that I grew up, I work really hard, and I was born and raised in a household that you work your behind off and you keep going and going and going, even when you're tired. I was also raised to have a work-life balance. So I try to find that balance between work and home life, because family is also super important to me. And culturally, that's how I was raised. Some other Latinx communities were raised similarly, but there's also differences, not only within the Latinx communities, but also when I think about our white families, when I think about our Black families, when I think about our Native families, we all have a different place of this in the work, and that's okay. And how do we honor not only our similarities, but our differences? And that's a big part of this adaptive leadership, paying attention to what your staff need and how you navigate even when times are tough. Next slide. So this is a quick reminder around 3 aspects. And in a minute, I'm going to argue there's actually 4 aspects to this. So diversity is who is in the room. Equity is who is trying to get in the room but can't. Inclusion is, has everyone's voice been heard? Those 3 are super important. The 4th one that I argue, and a lot of organizations, not just in child welfare, but also outside of child welfare, when you research DEI, there's that 4th aspect of belonging. Do I not only belong to myself, but do I belong in this space? Do I feel like I belong? So that first part is huge. Sometimes people don't feel that they belong in the space because they haven't gotten there internally to feel like they should belong, which is really sad because that comes from that historical context of oppression and marginalization and all of that. So that's a really sad place when somebody feels that they don't belong. But what's also key is that they feel that their colleagues and whatever environment they're in the workplace, they help them to feel that they belong. So feeling that you belong is different than being included, because you can be heard and you can be listened to, but if you don't feel that you belong in that space, that's going to have a different mood. That's going to have a different feeling, right? Could have a different outcome. So pay attention. I do argue that we need to pay attention to belonging as well, in addition to DEI. So now here's some of the data from the research. Just know that this is national data. This is not just in California. So this is throughout. And this was some research done recently. This is a published article just in 2021. But yes, first responders and child welfare, but also healthcare professionals. But this data here is specifically with CPS workers. It's not a surprise when you read this that nationally, we have predominantly white and non-Hispanic employees in child welfare specifically. We have less percentages of Black and Hispanic, I say Latinx, but the research obviously says Hispanic, employees of color. That's not surprising. And in many counties, children of color, especially Black and Latinx children, are overrepresented. So this is, again, a national phenomenon. When we think about the workforce specifically, and this example with the research around studies have shown that CPS workers who share or understand a family's culture may be better at understanding the family's needs, and that the child welfare agencies, like all organizations, benefit from a diverse workforce. On an organizational level, that diversity actually leads to outperforming, to really improved outcomes. And then also, some of you may know this, but on the leadership level for a minute, and it's not in this data here, but across the board nationally, and there's definitely some statistics internationally, that child welfare line supervisors are actually a key predictor on whether or not staff stay in the work, specifically line child welfare supervisors. So that data is not here, but I bring it in because I think that's a powerful statistic when I think about even our Latinx employees. If they feel connected to their immediate supervisor and their line staff, they're more likely to stay. I had an employee years ago when I was first supervising in San Diego County Child Welfare. I went on a 2.5, I think it might have been even 3-week honeymoon right after I got married. My staff knew we had a coverage plan. I had a senior social worker that was in the unit that was covering as a supervisor. One of my very talented staff in that unit, when I came back, she said, and I was supervising ongoing at the time, she goes, I think I need to move to ER. And I go, why? I didn't know you were interested in ER. I thought you weren't even interested. She goes, you know what, Javi? She goes, you made me realize when you were on vacation that you're the reason I stayed in ongoing. I didn't want to leave this unit because I like our working relationship together. And you really helped to engage me and keep me in the work. But when you left, I realized I need a change in program. And I said, oh my gosh, my first response was, I should have never went on my honeymoon. Of course I was going to go on my honeymoon. But my point in saying that is I experienced that firsthand from a staff outwardly saying she didn't want to even entertain a change in program because I was her supervisor. And she felt so connected to the work that we did together. That's a very powerful statement. And I know I'm not the only supervisor that's had that happen with staff. And sadly, the opposite can be true, that sometimes line staff have a disengaged supervisor and then they leave the work. And when we think about our Latinx employees, how impactful that is for families. If you're in a county that's small and has only a few or maybe one bilingual employee that's a line staff and they leave, you're struggling. It's hard. And it impacts morale and it impacts not only the family's life, but the culture, especially if you're a small county. Next slide. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about DEI hiring best practices. So these are just a few. This is not all of the best practices, but this is some examples. So asking questions that require applicants to discuss how they view culture and working with others whom are different than they are. Emphasizing your organization's commitment to being culturally responsive and making a pledge of anti-racist practices. Partnering with community organizations to actively recruit diverse staff. And then the last recommendation right now that I have is consider stay interviews with your diverse and experienced staff. I mentioned that earlier. Why are they staying in the work? It's so important to pay attention to culture. And yes, I'm talking today about our Latinx staff, but I also argue that it's not just our Latinx staff. It's our Black staff. It's our tribal staff, our Native staff. It's our Asian staff, all of our staff that we need to pay attention to, and also pay attention to our data. Again, Barry and Anita are going to talk a little bit about the data in a bit, but we need to allow all of these factors to come together in an intentional way so that we're not dismissing the importance of these staff that have different backgrounds. Next slide, please. So here are just a few examples of questions that you can ask if you're on hiring panels, or if you're a leader, perhaps a manager or a deputy director, that can influence HR questions with hiring practices. And maybe it's an internal promotion and you have more leverage to change some of the questions. I encourage you to pay attention to how you ask your questions, to hunt and to bring forth these folks of diversity and of color and of different backgrounds. So here are some examples. I would again encourage you in the chat, if you have any questions that you think are good for hiring diverse staff, feel free to put those into the chat so we can learn from each other. Or if it's a question you're curious about, maybe not a question that you put in a hiring format yet, but you're curious about that, I encourage you to put that in the chat. So one of the examples I gave here are, how do you define the concept of cultural responsiveness, and how would you engage a family that is very different than you? Another one is, this job often has many demands. Please give a few examples of how you plan to keep the children and families' voice the center of your work while still meeting task-driven deadlines. We know that's a reality. There are those task-driven deadlines, but we can also ask about how they engage a family that's very different than them. And that last one is, this position requires constant critical thinking and problem solving skills while still engaging diverse families. How will you team with and include diverse families and their supports in the decision-making process? Again, feel free to put in the chat if you have any other hiring questions you'd like to share with others. Thank you, Laura. So this last slide that I'm going to talk about is around awake, woke, and work. Thank you to Andrea. She sent me this article around this process. I had heard of it, but I took more of a deep dive into this before we finalized these slides for today, and I thought it was important to include. I mentioned earlier, all of us are responsible for this work. All of us are responsible for helping others to feel included, our Latinx families, our Latinx employees. It's like that bicycle, and every spoke in the wheel is important, from senior leaders to the data, to the organizational culture, to the learning, board of directors, everyone's important. So you see those definitions for awake, woke, and work. I'm not going to define those for you since you see those on there, on that visual, but I will say that I'm seeing a trend, not just in child welfare, but when I read about other organizations, more organizations are definitely hiring and increasing their numbers of racially diverse staff, but especially that woke part, organizations are evolving their structures to be more culturally responsive, to be more culturally aware. I don't think any organization is yet to that workplace, to that full accountability, to that full systemic change. I haven't seen one organization that's there yet, but I think it's a toggle between that awake and that woke is what I'm seeing. Thank you for your time, everyone. We're going to go to the next slide, and then I'm going to pass it over to Anita.
Thank you so much, Javier. I appreciate all the wonderful information that you shared, and there were lots of comments in the chat you might want to look over as we pass on the baton. The next section that we're covering is some information about Latinx representation in the child welfare workforce. And as we looked at data, both in terms of the numbers of children that are in the system or who come in contact with the child welfare system in California and across all the 58 counties, the three guiding principles that we used is, what do we know about those children and families and about the workforce that serves them? What do we need to know? You know, what are some unanswered questions in the data? And then, or what don't we know? And then what do we need to know in the future? How can we fill in those gaps in understanding the families that we serve, as well as the workforce that is stepping in to bring services to them. In the next slide, you'll see that in the last webinar, we covered some data about the families and children in California. And what we learned is that the majority of people that the child welfare system serves in every step along the way, whether it's the call to the hotline or the opening of an investigation and conducting an investigation, and if there's substantiation and movement to out-of-home care in some cases, and numbers of children in the foster care system and the number of children adopted, at every point along that continuum of child welfare, the majority of families and children that are served are from the Latinx community. And that's really important to think about. In some counties, what we found, and across the state overall, there is disproportionality. There's overrepresentation of Latinx families in the California child welfare system. Some counties don't have that, but many do, and across the whole state there are those numbers. But even if your particular county doesn't have overrepresentation, you're still serving more of that population. So even if compared to the other folks in the community, in terms of the numbers of Latinx families in the community, if it's not overrepresented, it's still a large proportion of who you're serving. And so that's why this webinar series is so very important for all the counties for their staff and leaders to engage in, because just to be able to be have cultural humility and serving those families and being culturally responsive to those families, it's important to understand who it is that you're serving, and knowing that because there are so many families in this particular overarching group, there needs to be a lot of attention paid. We also learned from the data, and we had looked at data that's in Berkeley, University of California in Berkeley, and what we learned is that there are disparate outcomes relative to white youth and families of the Latinx children. And so across the state and in some of the bigger counties in particular, but even some of the smaller counties. And so, not only are these folks coming into our system more, they're not faring as well. Although when we look at poverty and take that particular variable into account, then some of those disparities go away within the Latinx population. So what this kind of data tells us is that it's important for you all to go to that website at Berkeley and find out what is the representation of the families and children that you serve. How many families are Latinx? Are they overrepresented, and do they have disparate outcomes? And if they don't, that's something to celebrate. But it's also very important as folks are working with these families to understand more about them. So what we know is that we have a lot of folks that would check this box, but what we don't know is which cultural background any particular family might have. We don't aggregate or have the data on how many are from Mexico, how many are from the many Central American countries where people are fleeing and coming into the United States more recently or maybe historically. We don't know how many are from South America. We don't know how many are from Puerto Rico or other Caribbean nations and entities. And so understanding that there are, like the name of this webinar, there are many people and many different co-cultures within the Latinx experience, it's important to understand that. And to be able to dig deep into what the particular ways that a family operates and how their cultural values influence the way they're working and how you can engage with that. So finding out that it won't be in that data set, but maybe doing your own kind of research and asking those questions and trying to understand so that there can be that responsiveness is very important. And we hope in the future, as we look at future data needs, that we will understand more about these deeper understandings of the cultural backgrounds of the families and children that we serve. And so in that context, what Virginia and Barry are going to talk about is the workforce and how representative it is of the people that we serve. And the reason that they're going to talk about this is that Virginia was the executive director of CalSWEC. And before that, at Fresno State, she was the head of the Title IV Child Welfare Stipend Program. And she's also been on the boards of the Central and the Bay Area Academy, Training Academy, and chair of her School of Social Work. So she's got vast experience in workforce preparation, training, and monitoring. And then Barry was also director at CalSWEC of the in-service training program. So they're going to pull some of those data from CalSWEC and share more information about that piece.
Right. Thank you very much, Anita, for that introduction. On this particular side, you heard the three principles: things that we know, things that we don't know, and things we need to know. And that's the kind of the focus we had as we constructed this presentation and looked at the data. So there were some important lessons that we learned as a result that we want to share with you today. We want to emphasize that representation for example, of Latinx and the child welfare population is important, but it's not everything. It's not looking at data for data's sake. You can certainly go to Berkeley and get demographic data and certainly dig down into your data there at the county. But just remember our qualifier is that everyone is responsible for responsive practice and good outcomes. So we use data as a lead into asking ourselves those questions. Now that we know what we know data-wise, what are those responsive practices that we need to shore up or create? And let's look at the outcomes as a result. The other piece is, you heard Javi talk about earlier, the organizational culture and climate of the agency are key. I saw one particular statement, I think of Victoria, I can't remember Victoria's last name, saying that she stays at the agency because of the culture of that organization, which at some level tells me that it resonates with her and the work that she does. And so again, going back to the very items that Javi underscored, leadership is definitely important. And certainly using the CPM can help organizations really ask the important questions about their culture and climate and how they can leverage climate to really affect the larger culture. The third thing that we wanted to underscore is that representation does differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. You very clearly heard Anita say that in a particular county, the population may not necessarily have a high representation of Latino population in their area, but let's look at the children that are being served. There is going to be some kind of representation of Latino children and families, regardless of the size of the jurisdiction. But it's very important for us to know that the volume of that representation will differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. A couple of other points is that for newly hired line staff, over time, you'll see that Latinx representation has steadily increased. But again, representation is important, but not everything. We have to dig in there and find out what that representation actually looks like in the field and in the supervisorial areas. And then the last point is that for newly hired line staff in between the years of 2019 to 21, they had similar Latinx representation to the child population in 2020. But again, a cautionary. Just because you have a proportion of Latinx that reflects the proportion of children served does not necessarily mean that the children and the families are being served in the culturally relevant ways and resonant ways that we would like. And again, looking at the Latinx representation, as Anita said, it can vary. It cannot necessarily only include Mexican American, Latino. It can also include other groupings of Latinos. For example, Haitians are Afro-Latinos, and they are in counties in the South. So I'll stop right there and hand it over to Barry Johnson.
Thanks, Virginia. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to dive in a little bit more into the data that we do have, the quantitative data that we do have about the workforce. And again, this data comes from CalSWEC. Important to note, this data is collected by CalSWEC to evaluate their Common Core curriculum. It's not data that's collected specifically to look at the data on the workforce. We don't have data on first of all, we don't have data on the entire workforce. We have data on the newly hired workforce because CalSWEC collects data as newly hired line workers and newly hired or promoted supervisors complete their Common Core. So that's where we get this data from. And this first slide shows the blue bar shows the proportion of line workers, newly hired line workers in each of those years. So all the line workers hired in 2007, for example, 31% of those new line workers identified as Latinx. And in the same year, 2007, 24% of newly hired or newly promoted supervisors during that year, 2007, identified as Latinx. So again, it's the new staff. And in terms of trend, well, we also have a gap in the data. That bar on the right is striped to sort of signify, hey, we went for almost about 9 years of gap in data there. So CalSWEC may be able to fill in some of those gaps, but we do have a gap right now in the data as well. If we look at trends over time, you can see we have decent data from 2006 to 2012. It's pretty good quality data there. The blue line, the line staff jumps around a little bit, but it kind of shows a fairly steady rise, especially from 2007 and 2008, from the low 30s of staff identifying as Latinx to the high 30s by 2012. And then the trend appears to continue because we have that gap, and then it goes up to 48%. In the cohort in 2019 to 2021, where we have the latest amount of data. And you can go to the next slide. And this slide drills down into that last cohort. We talked about the last cohort is a pretty good cohort of folks. Everybody who completed the Common Core was hired and went through core from January of 2019 through June 30th, 2021. Drills down a little bit, and we see that 48.3, that 48% was rounded before, 48.3 identified as Latinx in this, and you can see the other racial identities that people identified with. Important caveat on this slide, they've since changed this and fixed it. But when this data was collected, and when that previous data was collected, people could only select one option. And one of the options they could select was that multiracial or other option. So we learned, if you were at the first webinar, you learned of the rich diversity of identities, racial and ethnic identities that Latinx folks have. And so it's likely that some of the folks that clicked that multiracial identified as multiracial, but also identified as multi-X. So we might be undercounting the Latinx folks in this cohort and throughout the data that we're talking about. And you can go to the next slide. And then this is the same data, sort of looked at it a different way. For those of you at the first webinar, we compared the child welfare population, and Anita talked about this, that there's disproportionate representation in child welfare for children and families, for Latinx children and families statewide in California, when we compare that to the child population. So this compares those newly hired child welfare workers in that cohort we just talked about to the California child population. Again, the Latinx folks are probably a little undercounted at 48.3%, but they're still the largest group. That's, they're the largest group of our newly hired staff coming in, our Latinx. And they're getting close to the same proportion of the population as the California child population of the time. Now, again, Virginia talked about the caveats that we have there. Representation doesn't necessarily mean that children and families are better served, or that the staff feel more comfortable and welcomed in the organization. Those are all things that we have to dig in deeper and look at. But it is important to have representation in the organization. You can see it's a pretty diverse group of our newly hired staff on that bar on the right. And I'm going to turn it back to Virginia for the next slide.
All right. We have a little graphic that's supposed to show up. Are you seeing it? There we go. Okay. Whew, I thought it was me. Okay. So we want you to take a look at this graphic that we've constructed, because to us, it begins the conversation. Remember, we're learners with you. And so much of what we're going to learn and what you're going to learn from each other is, where do we start? And how do we begin to answer that, or address that principle of what we don't know? Over to the left, you'll see that we have aggregate statewide demographic data on the entire workforce. You know, we really don't have it explicitly. Barry just showed you a hint of what we have, but we need to have larger amounts of data about the entire workforce. Past line staff, as you see, supervisors, managers, leadership. We have some, but it would be great to have more. We just don't know what that looks like. This is where the roles of counties are essential and critical in helping us to understand this, you know, what we do have more clearly. Again, county level demographic data. We have some. And actually, CalSWEC did do a study of county level demographic data of the workforce, but it was only 11 counties. So getting more explicit at county level, and more data on language ability. You heard Javi speak earlier about someone who's bilingual will enter the workforce, and before you know it, they're the go-to person for everything bilingual. But that becomes more complicated over time, especially when dialects enter. For example, in the Central Valley, there's a large representation of individuals from this population, Central America. We don't really have the data on language ability of the workers, and the proficiency level. It's one thing to claim you're bilingual, it's another thing to be proficient in the second language that you say you're bilingual in. And then, of course, what we don't know also are those critical linkages in child welfare agencies and the impacts on outcomes that it has. So again, referring back to the graphic, if you look, it looks like we need the I'm sorry, that went muted.
I'm sorry, I did that to you. Sorry.
Oh, okay. It wasn't me. Okay, so referring back to the graphic, here's what we need to know. In order for us to really understand what those outcomes for the Latinx youth and families are, we also need to know the experiences of Latinx youth and families, which workers can help us dig in deeper on that. You need to also address, really figure out what is the agency culture and climate, and of course, representation of Latinx staff. They all, the green, the orange, the red, all are gonna feed into that yellow circle of outcomes for Latinx youth and families. Okay, Barry.
Great. And you can go to the next slide. So now is when we charge what we need to know. So hopefully you've seen what we need to know a lot of different things. There's just a whole lot more research and data that needs to be collected. And you're going to have a chance to think about how you might collect and think about more data that you might need and want locally and at the state level in some breakout groups soon. But there's just so much that we need to know. First of all, one thing we haven't talked about is is the qualitative data. And there's certainly a ton of really important data and information that you can get qualitatively from about your agency. For example, how Latinx staff and staff of other groups are engaged with the agency, how they're engaged with the agency, how they're feeling about the agency, how they experience the agency. That's all information on the workforce that you can collect locally, and can be aggregated through studies and research, more at the more statewide and national level. Super important information to collect, and think about how you might collect that. It's often by asking folks, focus groups, asking them in sort of systematic ways. Second, we really need a much more systematic collection of demographic data at the national state and local level. We don't, we have some estimates, and Javi shared some estimates at the national level that researchers use, but we really don't collect it systematically at the national level. At the county level, many counties have their demographic data for their staff, but you could probably dig in deeper, as Virginia said, into all the range of ethnicities and language ability and other factors with the staff. And then we also know it's important to collect data throughout the whole organization, not just on the online staff and supervisors, but supervisors, managers, and leadership. Because representation, again, while it's not everything, is important, and it's important to have that information about the demographics throughout the organization. And again, I mentioned language ability, and Virginia talked about language ability about both families and the workforce. That you really need to have the information, the basic information about your staff and their language ability, and about the need for language ability with the clients that we serve at a much more systematic level. And finally, just way more research on that with the graphic that Virginia talked about, that critical linkage of the relationship. What's the real relationship between staff representation, the agency culture and client? How do they interact? How does that interact with practice, and how does all that stuff interact with the experience of Latinx families and the experience of all families in our system, and with outcomes for the youth and families? We really need just a tremendous amount more research on the interplay of all those different factors, because they all interact with each other. And you can go to the next slide. And we are going to move now to a breakout session. And you're going to have a chance to talk with your colleagues and reflect on both. The questions are here, but they will still be there in the chat at your breakout sessions. So you're going to have a chance to reflect with your colleagues and about the culture and climate conversation we've had and the data conversation we've had, and really think through how you might lean into the core practice model and be inquisitive and find out more about your organization and apply the core practice model to this. So it is now 10:09, so we will go for 16 minutes into our breakouts.
Okay, it's 10:45. Looks like lots of cameras are back on.
Judy, are you ready to take it away?
I'm ready to take it away. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Judy Weber. I'm the Deputy Director for Ventura County Children and Family Services. And I am honored to host this panel today. We have representatives from my home county, Ventura County, as well as Eva Ortiz from Monterey County. Everybody will be introducing themselves as we get through the questions, but I was going to start off with the panel and just first have Ventura County give some context about the project that they're talking about, and then Monterey County will have the ability to do the same. So if somebody from Ventura wants to just give us a high level overview of Neighbors Together, I'd appreciate it. Hi. Laura, you want to take it away? Letty, Renee?
I do not see them on right now, so.
Oh. Okay, well, why don't we start with Eva then?
Good morning, everyone. As Judy mentioned, my name is Eva Ortiz. I'm a program manager with Monterey County, and I'm excited to share with you some of the work that we are doing in Monterey County as it relates to our Latinx families and the collaboration that we have with our consulate, our Mexican consulate and our Guatemalan consulate. And other consulates as well. I think that for me, one of the things that stood out was I was in a child and family team meeting. I was sitting in at the meeting, covering for another supervisor, and we had a young lady who wasn't doing well. We didn't really have a lot of permanent connections for her. We had already reached out to the consulate. So for a long time in Monterey County, that's been our process. We have an MOU, we reach out to the consulate, and we work with our different partners with DEEF to help us locate family, to help us establish connections. And that's been the process. And this young lady, she kept telling the team, you know, I want to go home. I miss my family. She wasn't doing well. We didn't really have a solid permanent plan for her. And we started incorporating her family in the child and family team meetings, you know, through the phone at first. And we could see in her face when her family was part of the meetings that there was a change in her. And she said, and her family said to us, we want her to come back to Guatemala. She was in a situation where she had been trafficked by another family member. So when we started hearing from the family that that's what they wanted, and we heard from this young lady that she really wanted to go back home, we started to talk to our county council. We started talking to her attorney. We talked to her CASA. Initially, there was some resistance from some of the partners that, you know, and they said it out loud, you know, how could you or why would you consider returning her to her country of origin, maybe not understanding really the importance of family connections and being in a place where she felt cared for and loved and understood. So once we started explaining the importance of that, things started falling into motion. We included the school, her school teachers, her counselor in the process. We started a transition plan. DEEF provided us a thorough assessment of the family in Guatemala. We increased the telephone and the video contact with family. And as we started doing this, we started noticing a shift for her. And over a period of several months, we were able to work together to be able to come to court with a report that included every effort that we had made, and a solid plan to transition her back home. And I was one of the fortunate ones that I was able to make that journey back with her. And even when I think about it, I feel so happy to know that she was so excited to go back with her family, and to be part of that process was just such a turning point for me, because I also was able to recognize that family is very important and that connection is very important, and that what we do is for safety and permanency. So after I was able to experience that, I started to really take a step back and look at how can we strengthen our partnerships with our community members? How can we bring forward more about the importance of family and safety, and help those that maybe don't understand and see a bias to really understand the importance of what this means. And so because we had the support of, at the time, the program manager, the analyst team, when I became the program manager, it was really important for me to make sure that that connection with the consulates remained, that we were talking about with the families about what they wanted, what they saw as important, really teaming with them, understanding, hearing what they had to say, and really encouraging our staff to really be thoughtful when we're doing planning of services, delivery of services in a way that was inclusive. And so, part of what I hear from staff and some of the social workers at times is like, I never thought about it that way. That's a good question. And so because we're fortunate in our county to have leaders that really come from a place of wanting to understand and are curious about what families are saying and are wanting and what they are hoping as a result of coming through this process, we, in the last 3 years, we've been able to reunify a total of 7 families, which have totaled 11 children to either Mexico or Guatemala. We've been able to establish legal guardianships with relatives. We've been able to reunify with bio parents. And the schools have worked with us with transition plans. The therapists have worked with us. The consulate and DEEF have been excellent in providing us the documents that we need in order to present to the court and any of the other community partners the information that they need to help them make the important life decisions as they relate to permanency. I think that for us, some of the lessons learned have been really the importance of sharing the voice of the family and why it's important to look at reunification, not just within our borders, but across our borders because of the importance of family. And although we have had some pushback at times, I think that we're in a place now where our county council also understands the importance of that. And they will look at our reports and say, hey, maybe you should talk a little more about what services they'll have available once we reunify. Maybe you should talk a little bit more about the visits and the quality of visits. And because of that too, our staff have also really taken to heart the importance of the transition planning. So last month, we had a social worker and supervisor travel to Mexico City for a week-long visit with family because we're trying to do more as we can to not just have the Zoom visits and the telephone contact, but in-person visits when we can. And so that has really been a lesson learned for us that the more we can support contact and the more we can include family in the child and family team meetings, the families will themselves make a decision about what is in the best interest for their children or this child and what can they do as family together. I think that that has been some of the lessons learned for us. I think just really being able to take risks with our families and really work with our community. Like I said, our analyst team was also instrumental in ensuring that the consulate and DEEF and us were having regular contact with each other. We're coming together for meetings, talking about what could we do more of, how can they support us. We also were in the middle of a pandemic when things were shut down and travel wasn't recommended. We were able to also cross the border to reunify a little boy and his father. And it was just really great to see that the work continues despite of everything that's going on around us, and that we're able to lift up the voices of our children and our families. We also had a situation where we've had other permanent plans for children, and at times the family themselves will say, we would prefer that if possible our children be returned to us, and we've been able to make that happen, and so it's been a really great process to see.
Wow, I heard so many leadership behaviors, there from your story, from the foundational, respect and wanting to honor the family, and to the incredible level of engagement that you pursued with this young person who was really struggling. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and let Ventura talk a bit about, the context of our project, and then we'll take a deeper dive into some other questions. So Renee or Leslie, I will turn it over to
Hi.
you. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'll go ahead and kick us off. We apologize. We had some technical difficulties, and Laura, our senior manager, is trying to join the room, but it's saying she's unable to be admitted.
Yeah.
But I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. I'm Renee Lauder. I'm the program manager of Neighbors Together. I want to share really just, what Neighbors Together is. Neighbors Together is really this innovative CFS program that was designed with teaming units in mind to really pilot our best practices and improve our outcomes in a region that's hardest hit in Ventura County. Our Oxnard region, is one of our region's highest hit with referrals, that come into the hotline, entries, and other key outcomes that we want to see improved. We really started back with a citizen review panel, that helped us to pull together community agencies to create this shared understanding of issues that were facing our community and how we wanted to respond. We had to take a collaborative approach to really come to the table to share data. We did geo-mapping to see visually in our county where the high impact needs were. And like I had mentioned, we found the higher rates of referrals and entries. We saw 80% of youth arrests coming out of this area of Oxnard and Port Hueneme, higher rates of IEPs, lower rates of prenatal care, lower rates of wellness care, and higher crime rates. And it was about 50% was coming from this specific region, and the ethnicity is mostly Latin Mixteco. We also noted in the data dive during this time to better understand what was happening, the disproportionality rates of Latino children in care at that time were about 74%, which is much higher than the Ventura County Latino population, which is about 40 to 50%. So that's really where this all began early on was, doing that partnership work with community members and coming to the table through a citizen review panel. And that was really the birth and idea of this, putting together a program called Neighbors Together. And we have a lot more to share about it, Judy. So I'm going to follow your lead if you want me to go through, all the points of our presentation. And we also have a PowerPoint, or if you want to go through the questions.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and ask some questions. So the first one is why and what data led you to innovate? So talk more about, how we use the data then to create the program, to design the program, et cetera. And Eva, do you want to go first? Any data that you used in your effort? I heard you, yours was so heavy in partnership, which was just beautiful.
Yeah, I think that part of what we started looking at is there was a period of time where our relative placements were not that high. I think we were around 10 to 12%. And so I started looking at, well, what are we doing? What could we do more of? What are some of the barriers? And then we just started looking, and I just sent the supervisors that the data that we were able to collect, we're at about 34% right now. So I don't know that I have like any specific kind of process that I've had other than to just look at the data and see like, what are we doing? Mm-hmm. And I have started having conversations with our system support to see what other data we can track to support some of this work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
It's a process, huh?
Yes.
It's kind of once you start digging into one area, you want to know more about other areas. So that's exactly where it starts.
Yes.
Yeah. Renee, go ahead. Or Letty.
Sure. In terms of the data early on, through that deep data dive, I want to say this was a few years back, and with the citizen review panel, there was baseline data that was looked at in terms of our disproportionality rates. I believe it was around 75%. And through the course of our work, we're continuing to monitor and looking at the shifts that are happening in terms of, referrals coming into this target zone of Oxnard that we're focusing on, looking at the entries. And from that early, and as well as the disproportionality. And so through the course of this work and attention to this, we're in the initiatives that have rolled out around this, we're really seeing a decrease, and it's really a phenomenal trend we're seeing, and it really leaves me speechless to really think about all the contributing factors, everything from SOP to our core practice model, and the other initiatives, that we've put around this, Neighbors Together. Right now, from 2018 to 2021, we've experienced a 19% decrease in the total referrals from the 3 zip codes. And we have charts in our slideshow if we have time to look at that later. In terms of entries in the 3 zip codes, we've experienced a 33% decrease in entries from the Neighbors Together zip codes from 2016, when we did that early citizen panel work, to 2021. Some other interesting trends we're seeing is really by creating these teaming units and Neighbors Together, in which we have multiple programs working side by side. We were able to expand and partner with Family Preservation, that voluntary non-court intervention program, to help really support families avoid entry into the system. We saw that by integrating Family Preservation and partnering more closely with them between 2021 and in our current months this year, we've almost served more families than we did the whole year last year. And we're only in about 5 months into 2022. So yes, the data we're seeing, the baseline, the trends are getting better for these 3 zip codes. But to be honest, you also have to look at the disproportionality that still exists. And in the data that we're looking at right now, Ventura County still has challenges with disproportionality. We did a data drill down at looking at who's calling our hotline and what ethnicity groups are those caller groups from. Like many counties, your hotline reporters may be your counselors and therapists, your school personnel, your law enforcement, medical professionals. Those were some of the top groups in the community calling on families. And we looked at what ethnicity groups are they calling on. And across all of the groups I just mentioned, Latino families is the highest at over 60%. Where other ethnicities much lower, and white ethnicity at 20% and under. And so you'll see, even from the very beginning, the disproportionality starts from the calls we receive. And then you see the connecting pieces of this in terms of the referrals that come in and what ethnic population what population are the referrals substantiated on. And so even within the last 12 months and looking at the data, we're challenged with Latino families, 66%, even though it's less than what it was, earlier in our citizen review panel work. When it was about 75%, we've seen a reduction, but there's still so much work ahead of us. Even with the new entries by ethnicity, if you look across Ventura County, we're challenged with having 69%. And so this really brings to light the importance of the things we're doing to tackle all of these areas. We have to be proactive about our preventative strategies. It makes me think of the importance of expanding our family preservation programs, expanding our school-based social worker programs for the preventative work, which hopefully Letty will be able to share a little bit about that with you today. The importance of building community liaisons and partnering with your groups that are calling the hotline. We have this data really at our fingertips. Safe Measures, you can do a quick check and look at your racial equity measures, and it'll show you what's happening in your neighborhoods, what's happening in the zip codes, which ethnic groups are overrepresented in your county. And when you have this data at your fingertips and you're seeing what's happening, we have a responsibility to act. There has to be this relentless and resilient pursuit to try to improve outcomes and fix the rate of disproportionality that exists.
Thank you, Renee. We'll move into the next area we want to talk about. And so this question is about how core practice model behaviors are used in the creation of efforts to impact, to either impact disproportionality, or how CPM behaviors are being lifted up in order to better serve Latinx families. So you want to go ahead, Eva, and take it away?
Sure. I think that one of the things that we've been doing on a regular basis is really using inquiry and exploration with our staff. And so trying to do coaching so that they're able to do that with our families as well. So one of the things that we do for the ongoing services is I do meet with the supervisors and the social workers as they're navigating permanency with families. So we meet about every 3 months, depending on how long the family is going through the process with us. And so there are some questions that we ask our social workers, our supervisors, and then we follow up with families to really try to understand, you know, what does the family hope to happen as a result of this? What are some of their barriers? Are we sharing the same language when we're talking about the safety concerns? Are we trying to also understand what it is that they see as a safety concern compared to what we see as a safety concern, and really coming from a place of inquiry? And I think that as I've seen this, I've been doing this now for 2 years, staff come better prepared, you know, to talk about, you know, there is this network, we're exploring this with the family, or you know what, I haven't done that yet, but you know, how can we do this moving forward? And so when the family see that their social workers are willing to take risks with them, are willing to partner with them, when the supervisors see that, it just has a positive reinforcement for how we are looking at our work, how we're looking at our case plans, the delivery of a specific service, how we're able to pivot with the court to make different recommendations that maybe we haven't seen before, and how the court is able to go with our recommendations because they see, you know, not just the black and white of a parent did this or didn't do this. So that has been key, and also our ability to engage with our staff and our supervisors and the families in a different way.
Yeah, beautiful. That's great. I heard so much from that. I heard advocacy. I heard wanting to increase accountability among the folks that you know are working on a particular case. I'm hearing again the importance of relationship building and you know the teaming behaviors. Thanks for that. Renee or Letty, you guys could take it away. And I think if you could focus in on, you described our model is based on teaming. So if you could really take us in on a deeper dive on that.
Sure, I'll let Letty, I'll kick us off, and then Letty's going to talk about teaming and the teaming units that were formed for Neighbors Together. But really with core practice model, you'll see throughout, you know, our panel discussions how core practice model leadership behaviors were really applied throughout this journey of developing Neighbors Together. Everything from our early inquiry and exploration and learning from other counties. San Diego had a neighborhood model that we learned from as well. We did the citizen review panel to connect with, you know, our community partners, the geo mapping, the data dives, really. And there's other parts of this journey as well in terms of our engagement that was really built on the engagement strategies to use for this program were really built on those core practice model behaviors, our safety organized practice, our agency we believe statements that have really guided our work to try to keep families safely together. I'm going to go ahead and hand this off to Letty to talk a little bit about the NT teaming units and share a little bit about that with us.
Thank you. So my name is Letty Garibay Fregoso. I'm a supervisor with Neighbors Together, and I do have a blended or teaming unit. I think earlier we heard from Javi and a few others talk about the importance of connections. And I believe that every human needs to feel connected to someone. When we develop trusting and healthy relationships, it allows us to develop resiliency and working together, and sometimes even overcoming trauma or other challenges that have happened in our lives. A helping profession, when disrupted, can impede progress. And that's something that we have definitely learned in Neighbors Together. How often I think all of us have heard clients share with us the challenges of having to stop or start over or retell their story. And so for us, in an effort to support families involved in our system, we began to explore ways to really honor the family's story so that we can ultimately support them in making the changes that are necessary. And it's the type of change that really keeps families together. So this was very important to our work. On the flip side, a relationship that is consistent from start to end really offers stability, continuity, and momentum for families. And so for these reasons, we identified a high priority activity to really focus on developing these teaming units that would support our work. We started actually with 2 teaming units that included a blending of our 2 core programs, which were emergency response and ongoing. So there was a little bit of work that we were able to do with those 2 programs and really bridging families and lessening the transition from ER, let's say at a detention level, and getting them through the J&D process and into ongoing. So eliminating at least an additional caseworker assignment. As we really began or continued to design and develop these teaming units and seeing the magic of teaming, we found opportunities to grow. In our current state, we have 5 teaming units working side by side within one program. This includes Healthy Start, a school-based prevention program that I'll share with a little bit more later, Family Preservation, Court Alternative, ER, Court, Ongoing, and a resource navigator to help us kind of bring everything together. Sharing the responsibility and teaming at critical points in our work with families has had a positive impact on our practice, as we believe, and we believe that it will continue to improve outcomes for families. So when we really think about, well, what is a teaming unit? We've already shared a little bit about that, but for us in Ventura County, I think it can best be described as an intentional designed team of blending of programs under one supervisor, one program manager that helps us work together to reduce those transitions for families, to honor that supportive relationship. This approach has really helped us to develop the trusting and supportive relationships with families, their support network, in such a way that keeps families connected to their natural environments as they take baby steps in their healing journey. Our teams are strategically designed, placing programs together that make sense for effective engagement with families, their support network, and best practice integration to keep children safe at home with their families. Should a family enter our system, teams work diligently to wrap around families with appropriate support to promote unification. As Renee shared earlier, within 6 months of integrating family preservation into our program, we saw a 14% increase of NT families remaining safely together with support. And that really is something to be proud of. I'd like to just take a little bit of time to share my personal experience as a teaming unit supervisor. And in the spirit of modeling CPM behavior and being transparent with you all, I have to say I was a little worried about really accepting this challenge. Historically, teaming units have not been the favorable approach in Ventura County. And there's a lot that just kind of comes with that, a lot of worries about, well, what do we do? Are we ignoring, the case carrying social workers? Are we only responding to ER because they're in crisis mode? And all of those things. And then just, our own personal experience in the child welfare system as leaders, like focus, maybe like for me, my personal experience was focused on emergency response. But I do believe that as a leader in child welfare, we have to push past our own experiences, past the history that we have as an agency, to really look at some personal accountability and being open to growing and not necessarily doing the same thing that we've always done. I think that today, the message of today is really around what we're doing might not be working, and it's okay to do things different. And if it hasn't worked in the past, then identifying really how we can make those changes so that we're not continuing to do what we tell our families, right? We tell our families, we got to start doing something different because what you're doing is not working. And if we continue to do the same thing over and over, we're going to get the same results. So really taking a pause to reflect on how we're modeling that and how we're integrating that into our practice. So very quickly, I became excited to be able to learn from my mistakes, and Neighbors Together for me personally. And I think we were also able to create it for our social workers, that we no longer live in fear or guilt about maybe some decisions that we've made in the past that weren't the best decisions. And how do we learn from those mistakes so that we can be better for the youth and the families that we serve? This experience, I believe, firmly has made me a stronger leader in child welfare. It has given me a sense of understanding how what this hand does in ER like really impacts what this hand will have to do in ongoing or court and beyond, and how together these hands are going to work together to bring the families back together if they are separated through the process. My peers and I talk about this all the time. We have gained an appreciation for each other's programs. Our staff have gained the same appreciation. I believe many of our staff have really followed in our footsteps in taking on a more leadership type of role to really move this forward and to make those changes. We all saw the data today. We've done deep dives in our county to really look at, okay, now that we know this, like how do we change that, and how do we respond to our data? How do we make those changes? Really, this this transformation in our workforce is really I believe credited to the work that we've done to make these teaming units organic and really develop some team decision-making structures. When family stories are honored and remembered by workers and supervisors, this promotes healing. It gives families a sense of mattering to someone, and it gives social workers a sense of making a difference in others' lives. As a system, when families heal, we heal too. And that I believe is really what will help create a healing system. So that is what I have for teaming units in my experience.
If we have more time, Judy, we also have more information to share really about another teaming activity in terms of our cultivating solutions.
Yeah, I know that I did get a note in a separate chat that there's interest in that. So do you want to go ahead and present that? And Laura Carmona is the senior program manager with Ventura County, and she was having technical difficulties, and so now she's online with us.
Sorry about that, everyone.
This cultivating solutions that I'm going to talk about really builds on what Letty was just speaking about in terms of learning from each other. Cultivating solutions really is intended to be a team consultation, really to help broaden our insights and support staff in a rigorous balanced assessment. We learn from other counties that do red teams and other types of team consultation forums, and we built on that, and we built on the SOP and the SDM, and we integrated these pieces into our cultivating solutions venue. There's particular focus in cultivating solutions to really look at bridging gaps in resources, as well as tracking the system barriers that families are facing. We wanted to make this a safe place and a expected place in which we can bring our blind spots to the table and talk them through, that we can filter bias, that we're creating prompts in this mapping that we do for families at risk of separation. So we actually have built-in prompts into our mapping tool, our cultivating solutions mapping tool, and I'll share some examples. We want to know, was the social worker matched with the family's primary language? Are we talking through the bias and blind spots and exploring that and mitigating that? Are we asking about the family, their struggles around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are we bringing the cultural supports identified and including them in the CFTM? So these are just some examples. We're holding each other accountable to making sure we're doing the best work in cultural responsiveness and identifying new strategies so we can improve our response with families. And this consultation venue is really with the goal of exploring all ways also that we keep families safely together. That's the goal of this. This Cultivating Solutions is in its early CQI pilot, but we've been working on this for the past year and developing it, trying it on, bringing community partners to the table. A learning lesson for me in this was really like, we have to do more work in getting those community partners to the table to do this with us. And so rather than waiting on, the development of formalized cultural brokers, we are the cultural brokers. We have staff that have relationships with community partners that aren't at the table enough. And it was actually through our social worker staff, I think Daphne might be on the line, who helped bring one of our great partners to the table to do this work with us, MyCop. And we have others that we're working on. We have a whole list of them. And we're the cultural brokers working with the community agencies, to make them part of this process and hear their voice and have them be at that consultation table with us.
Thank you. Okay, and Lori, you dropped the Cultivating Solutions tool in the chat, and I believe there might have been some questions in the chat as well about the navigator position. I would liken that to linkages, the linkages effort in Ventura County. We've broadened the scope of that individual to be focusing more on the broader concept of family stabilization. So their interventions would include access to benefit programs, but also housing programs. And this person is also very knowledgeable about other community resources. So we're poised to be expanding that as well very shortly, because this group here and others who've been involved in the development of this effort, and I give all credit to them. I mean, they really have created this program, and so now the next step is to begin to take this to scale across the organization. And so the Cultivating Solutions tool is being used more broadly.
If there's a couple more minutes we can speak to on it, I really wanted Letty to share an experience of Cultivating Solutions and the impact that it had that I think will really help resonate.
I think we have a little bit more time. I will go ahead and want to give Eva a chance. If you have anything to add in, from your experience with CPM behaviors, anything that you recalled that you didn't get to say that you'd like to say.
I think I've said most of everything. I think that as I was reflecting back about, the change, change is hard. And so it's a slow process at times. And I think that the more we can allow our staff to have a place to ask questions, to also, for me, it's been helpful to come from a place of wanting to understand and partner with staff and listening for what are the biases in there. The more we can be open about those conversations, even if we feel at times that, okay, I felt like we had gone 10 steps forward and now we're going 5 steps back, it's okay, because it's a process. And so if we model that to our staff, then our staff are also more likely to model that for their families and engage in that way. And so I think that that's been something that I also have to remind myself of sometimes when, you receive maybe the same question multiple times, and it's okay. And it's okay to ask, we've been successful at this before. We've done this before for other children. We've been able to reunify them with relatives. What is different this time? So that would be something that I wanted to share.
Great. And if you, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have a story of, barriers or challenges and anything specific that you've done or strategies that you've used to move through those challenges.
Yeah, we have. I mean, our collaboration and our teaming with our various community partners has been great. And at the same time, because there is bias in terms of when we're looking at what is in the best, for some people, what is in the best interest of the children is to stay in the United States. And sometimes having those conversations about the importance of family can become a little contentious. And I think that, one of the barriers that we also have had during COVID is everything slowed down because of the pandemic. So the rate of how quickly the consulate and DEEF could respond to our requests for assessments was slowed down. So that also somewhat discouraged staff, but we were always there saying, well, let's reach out again, let's call them again. And taking risks, you know, there was a period of time where things were really, really closed, and the consulate and DEEF told us, we want to support this, and we know we have the assessment, everything in writing is good to go. We just can't meet you on the side of the border to facilitate the transition. And we waited a few more months, and we waited, and I was in constant communication with the father and the child. And at a certain point, I started to see that the little boy was declining in his functioning. And so I talked to my deputy director at the time, and I said, Laura, I know that we have everything in writing ready to go and the court has approved it, but I know we're currently closed. How would you feel about me going over there, you know, despite everything being closed? And I worked with my staff to make sure, and with Laura to make sure that, you know, I was able to go there, and we were able to reunify, you know, despite some of the barriers with the pandemic, despite things being slowed down. So I think that once staff saw that, you know, I was willing to take the risk and go ahead and do this, I started to see an increase, you know, of like, okay, we're reaching out to this family here, we're reaching out to this state, we're following up weekly to see what we can do. So I think that that has been helpful. And also just remembering that our community partners have different lenses and different perspectives. And so they will also continuously ask some of the same questions, right? About why we're doing this, why is this important, how we considered this, how we considered that. And that's okay too. And it's okay that they're asking questions, because we want them to ask questions, because we want their buy-in about the process as well.
Yeah, powerful. That's powerful stuff. Thank you. Okay, so we have one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the group to ask any kind of questions. But the last one is, what are you learning along the way in terms of both process and results? Go ahead, Ventura. What do you think about that?
Oh, let me jump in here. One of the areas that I think connects back to some of the information presented this morning is really around culture, organizational culture. And, you know, from where Letty and Renee are really at, you know, boots on the ground. They are the manager, the supervisors in the program. And so where I sit, I'm a little more, you know, I have a step away. But what's important to me and what I am able to observe is the culture that this program has developed, between the teaming units, the intentionality around calling out culture and things of that nature. It creates a space of safety for staff to be able to have these difficult conversations, to look at their practice, how their practice is reflecting on decisions for families, creating a culture that says we are here to learn, we're here to ask and inquire and partner with families. And so it's really about, and also I think that the other piece that I would add is that the staff that are participating in this really have a commitment around their practice and that they want to be practicing in this way. And so when I think about, you know, the slides that were shown this morning, that, you know, representation is one piece, and we were intentional with that as well. But it's also around a value that staff bring, and kind of a work ethic to want to do practice differently, and to want to come from a place of humility and engage with families and ask questions. And so when that slide earlier showed kind of your representation, but more around the commitment to practice shifts and changes leads to those outcomes. And so I think a big factor, we're having some great responses to our outcomes and data and the practice shifts, but the cultural piece. I think, you know, a big lesson learned is you have to be intentional and tend to the culture that you're developing, tend to the culture that staff are part of this process. They're part of the process of designing what the work should look like. We value their input into the impacts and the things that they're seeing in the community, and the challenges that families are having. the challenges that they're having with partners, with our court partners, with challenging the status quo. And I think the final thing I would say is really holding on and having the courage to stay the course. You know, it's been a couple of years now, and we've had to shift resources, and we've had to, you know, maybe come into some challenging conversations with our court partners who are questioning why we're doing things differently, and you're leaving kids at risk and things of that nature, but really having the courage to stay the course, to commit the resources, and it's financial resources, but it's staff and personnel resources, and even just the energy that it takes to be relentless. And you know, so I think the culture that you develop, you have to be intentional. You have to have the courage to stay the course and just continue. And those numbers and those outcomes will prove, you know, will prove your case for you. But it's really around the commitment and the values that staff hold.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, so I wanted to engage Laura Neal. I know you're with us, and you're the deputy for Monterey County, and I bet you're so proud of the work that's being done there. After, you know, given what you've heard today, you know, what are your thoughts about what's been presented by both, and then what more can possibly be done, you know, in this regard, in serving the Latinx population? Any thoughts you have there?
Thank you for bringing up that. But I want to say that I want to thank you to everybody.
Oh, I think your audio is a little muffled. Yeah, I don't think it's going to work. Oh, darn. Okay, so the last piece I just want to share with this group is that yesterday, our 2083 effort in Ventura County is not just looking at high need youth or in-care youth, but we really are using it for a launch pad and addressing the entire continuum of care. And so yesterday was our board presentation where every director from our public agencies that we work with, as well as Ventura County Office of Ed and our local regional center, were in front of the board, and we really were able to highlight our vision for cross-system integration and alignment. And so I think that is the other big piece, you know, of what we're doing in Ventura County, because yes, we can be innovative and do things differently within child welfare, but really we want to impact the larger system as well. So we're excited for the work that's now going to be done across systems with regard to integrated core practice model, training and coaching, and then the subsequent community engagement efforts that we're going to undertake in Ventura County, similar to what we did with our citizen review panel, but now wanting to go a little bit deeper and identify some grassroots efforts and voices, right, of the community. So with that, I'm going to just go ahead and open it up for questions for the group that you might have. For either Ventura or Monterey.
I have a question. Can I speak?
Yes.
Or I'm not a camera. This is Rocio Bundes. I'm from Santa Clara County. And thank you for today. It was awesome. I feel like I learned a lot. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the resource navigator position. I don't remember which county just spoke about it, but talked about that as a person that helped navigate the Healthy Start and some of the other teaming resources. So can somebody speak to that resource navigator? Is that an internal position, and what is their role?
Sure, I can start. So the position is actually in partnership with our CalWorks department, and it's a CalWorks position. It's an employment specialist lead worker who is embedded in the CFS department and co-housed with, and when I say co-housed, we're virtual essentially and teleworking. So, but is embedded into the supervision of our NT staff and with one of our units. And the intention here is really around bringing our employment specialist who has a vast knowledge around CalWorks, CalFresh, Medi-Cal, all of those things, access to CalWorks database or CalWin database. And really, it's our response to our linkages, our wider linkages effort. This is really intended to be, it's a pilot in that it's intended and targeted at our NT families right now. But the model is really built on a warm handoff. And again, a teaming partnership between this worker and the CFS worker and the family to remove barriers. Right now, we're focusing on our family maintenance and those transitioning into family maintenance to create the stability that families need while regaining custody of their children, and in hopes that we're going to be able to dismiss their cases. But it absolutely is a partnership, and it's a partnership across the department.
Thank you so much. That's helpful.
I know that Laura, I don't know if your audio is working now. I would invite you to say something. Oh, okay, her question is, the question that Laura put in the chat was, Letty, Laura, and Renee, what fears did you have prior to implementation?
I can speak a little bit from just like my perspective as a supervisor. I think that the biggest fear was, this pilot not being successful, like just failing. I think that was like the biggest fear. The second fear really came around how we're going to move through the change, because change is difficult. How are we going to move ourselves, our staff, and then our peers internally and externally? And I think that when like Neighbors Together first started, that like lingered for a little while. And sometimes to be honest, it still comes back because we still are at different phases, of change. But seeing the positive outcomes that we have just witnessed with families, hearing from families that this experience was different than their last dependency, even hearing staff say, wow, like I didn't know what this would look like if I did it this way. Seeing staff pause for a moment before making decisions really kind of just erase those fears a little bit. But yeah, it was definitely a scary time in the beginning, and mostly around just not being successful, failing, not just as a program, but failing families.
Yeah, I think I'll add that, I think part of it was a little bit of the innovation. Kind of, there wasn't a model that or a program that we created a contract and brought somebody in and said, okay, just implement, here's the fidelity and so forth. Sure, we sought consultation. Renee mentioned San Diego County came in and really shared their model. We looked at a couple of other counties and I think some other states as well to really get a baseline of how to design this. But I think the solution was kind of trusting the process. And so really letting staff, really putting practice in the areas that we knew were causing us challenge and listening to staff, and then having a commitment from our leadership team to change those practices, to have the space to create different ways of going about the work that we have to do. And the fear came in like Letty said, what if it fails? And, just like I said earlier, kind of sitting in the courage to say, this feels like the right thing to do, right? We're all trained social workers and professionals and have a long history in this work. And instinctually, our training and our social work ethics and all of those things are telling us that this is the right thing to do by families. And so being able to just sit in that unknown creates some anxiety and some fear. And I think the challenge of our partners, right? And really trying to bring along partners. We're a social service agency. We're all, MFT or MSW trained type staff. And so this is the kind of work that we do. This is the value system that we hold, but our partners don't always think in the same way. And really being patient with the process to bring them along, and being vulnerable enough to hear their worries so that we could be responsive and not just respond with, well, this is the right thing to do, but to be able to really think about the challenges or the concerns that they were raising and figuring out a structure and a process to be responsive to that.
Absolutely. I think that feedback is critical, and hearing staff, hearing families, and building off their ideas to work through those challenges. I don't know how many of you have read that Hero to Host, but sometimes you point to the top to solve all the problems, but really the solutions are within all of us. And so that really, yeah. Another piece of that is I wanted to mention the aha moments. Capturing the aha moments is what kept me going in this. So we hit obstacles along the way. We felt the resistance, we felt the worries, and being able to capture those aha moments, and they still stick with me. I remember it was two of the supervisors, Letty, another one that said, you know, this doing teaming units and learning the other programs and working side by side, it made me a better supervisor. I remember hearing from families at CFTM saying, thank you for being with me from the very beginning, because we lessened transitions and they were staying with the families longer. And even the supervisors provided a sense of continuity for the families because they were with them from beginning to end, you know, as we worked in this teaming unit environment. So those aha moments, I think, is what helped keep me going too. And hearing the feedback and working with the solutions that staff came up with.
Yeah. And I'll just add, you know, my own gentle pressure relentlessly applied. I am known for saying things like, our system is designed to give us the outcomes that we're getting. If we want different outcomes, we need to design something different. And so, you know, giving them that expectation, you know, also helped a little bit in their creativity. But again, it was really their what they have developed. So any other questions that we have here? I'm looking in the chat. I don't see any. I'm happy to, oh, one more message.
You know, if I can just add one point, Judy, while you're doing that, but I just want to say that, you know, I think Judy's commitment and her vision to this process, I think, has laid the groundwork for us to do the things that we have accomplished from a practice perspective. And, you know, Judy has supported at a macro level, right, across systems in really saying, here's a vision of how this work should be. And without that kind of support, yes, the work happens at the lower levels, but you have to have the commitment and the vision of, you know, Judy at her level, directors across systems, to be able to really make this work happen. So that was a huge success.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, 11:44. Laura's still not working. Laura, I appreciate you said you guys.
And Judy, you can't retire.
I know, as I read that right now, I got a little scared. I got a little scared when I saw that. I appreciate that. I'm not seeing any other questions.
I was just going to add, I think that the challenge that Judy put before us and raised the importance around and improving our outcomes, it really made us stretch ourselves. And I really attribute the initiative she was in relentless pursuit over within our organization that led to the shifts that we're seeing and decrease in referrals, help lead to decrease in entries in those neighborhood zip codes. There's so much that Judy has brought to the table in Ventura County that I really believe is helping externally what's happening with outside community partners, as well as internally, and seeing this shift in the data. We still have a ways to go, but she's, I think, created this legacy and inspiration for us to keep going even when she retires. So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. I appreciate that. Let's see, what we just heard is the operationalization of CPM leadership behaviors. It works. They do. They work, you know, and sometimes some days we're better at it than other days, but you know, we always have another chance to get back to it. Yeah. Leadership, another famous quote that I say is that leadership is a function, it is not a title. And so I think there's leadership at every level of the organization. It's a matter of leveraging it.
And I think that's one of the areas we try to promote is really, as we were building this model, staff came in and said, okay, well, what is it we're doing? Why are we doing this? There was a lot of questions. And so really being able to say, look, each one of you is a change agent. Each one of you is, from a grassroots perspective, can make a difference in what you do. And so really having the commitment of staff to say, okay, I'll do it. You didn't give me quite a roadmap. There's just sort of a tentative box that says, let's try this. And staff were willing to do it. And they were willing to do it because of, the reason why they came into this field. And so I think really being intentional to call that out, to reinforce with them when we saw kind of some of them stumbling or getting a little, anxious about different things or struggling with really difficult situations. Really being intentional to reinforce that commitment and kind of the why, right? We talk in our organization, talk a lot about the why behind the different things that we do, and really promoting that piece just, I think, keeps people motivated to keep challenging.
I want to jump in and say, I just appreciate so much the different levels and approaches and descriptions of, I kind of heard this, the agency's intent from the top tier leaders, the intent to serve families well and in a way that they would be honored and that would make sense, and that we would preserve their family and their family culture, keeping them out of the system. This overall agency intent combined with flexibly applying innovation, looking at what's working, growing where it's working. So it's intent and then it's flexible implementation. Both together are needed, it seems like, from what we heard. So I think, Laura, thank you so much. We're so sorry that your audio didn't work, because we would have loved to have had your voice in here next to Judy's, as your two counties were profiled. So Laura, we thank you and Judy for setting your intention and then giving the space and the trust and the respect and the resources to let your very talented staff innovate and adapt using data along the way. Building relationships as Letty modeled. Thank you so much for that relational and connection piece that really holds everything together. Gary, I'm going to flip it to you, and I'm going to pull up your slide if you want to talk a little bit about what's to come in June.
I do. Thank you so much. I'd like to just start by saying this has been such a rich and informational webinar. I'm going to start with the panelists. I think it might have been Anita Berry did a slide about organizational theories, and they talked about how everyone is responsible for this work. And just seeing the leadership that this panel just portrayed, it was quite impressive. And it's very clear that Judy and Laura, that you are building your teams and that they are responsible for helping you to lead the efforts. I want to kind of reflect back on our original objectives. And I'm just very impressed to hear how we lift up the stories of the various Latinx cultures. We lift up their dreams, their hopes, their passions, their stressors, their desires, and how that drives and influences how we interact with those families. Some other things that stood out with me today was just the partnership with the consulates. With your consulates, with your various types of programming, the sharing of information. I heard one of you talk about pulling some information from another county and how you applied that within your county. Mm-hmm. And then Laura, you talked about values. The core practice model and leadership behaviors were built on a set of beliefs and values. And you talked about those values, how they show up in your commitment, and then ultimately how they show up in behaviors. So I just just want to commend you all for the work and for the presenters, the data presentation, the organizational theory presentations, and just in anticipation of webinar number 3, we're going to continue to reflect on the learnings from webinars 1 and 2. We heard lots of leadership behaviors lifted up today, advocacy, accountability. We really heard a lot about engagement. So we're looking forward to continue to lift those up and dig a little deeper into those. We heard some today about practice strategies, about the neighbor program. We'll continue to talk about practice strategies that work. From the family and the partnership perspective. We'll continue to highlight the role of leadership and its use in CPM guidance and for nurturing organizational conditions that are needed for effective Latinx practice. And we will continue to just appreciate the role the CPM can play in enhancing child welfare system for all families, tribes, and communities. And I know that we clearly heard that today. I want to remind everyone that, as Andrea stated, today was number 8 of a 9-part series, number 3 of the Latinx series. The next Latinx webinar will be June 29th. And to remind you guys that if you go to the CFPIC website, you go to CPM and then REI. There are some rich resources because this is all building on itself. Today, we talked about Latinx, but what can we use from today to apply to tribes, to African Americans, LGBTQ. So a lot of what we talk about, these practices can be applied in lots of other areas. A big thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all that contributed today, and Stuart's absence. And on behalf of Stuart, I want to thank you for your efforts and this great work. I'm just so proud to be a Californian and be part of this work. We are a leader in the country, trust me. So thanks again. And you guys, as we conclude, just let's be mindful of what's going on in Texas. And we are a community, right? And how what happens to one does impact the other. Yeah. So thank you and have a great rest of the day.